Hello, everybody. Today we're going to talk about media ethics. Namely, we're going to go over a case study, and we're going to talk about 4 important philosophers who have contributed to our understanding of this. Now, before we get going, there's 2 things to talk about. There is one, the idea that we're not going to have a quiz directly over this material because the quiz that is this week that you are taking by Wednesday is going to be the last quiz of the semester, but the material from this presentation will find its way onto the final exam, so you'll still want to make notes through the rest of this. Another thing is that the stuff you're going to learn in this presentation is a very quick look at the kinds of things that you'll spend nearly an entire semester going over after you pass this course and go on to take media ethics, which is a course we have in this department. Okay, so let's get going. So we're talking about the concept of ethics and the ethical foundations that allow us to know right and wrong in the interaction between media and society. Ethics is roughly a rough understanding of what is good for society. But knowing this is really tricky because we're not really good at being consistent with that kind of thing. If you think back about some of the stuff we talked about last week with the law presentation, there's this divergence between the law side of things and the ethics side of things. There are things that we can do legally that ethically we might not want to do. And oftentimes we tend to define things as being ethical if they are legal, but those 2 things are very different. Like legally, we can interview and photograph children in public without the consent of their parents. Laws in all 50 states in the United States say that if a child is in a public place, you can take pictures of them and publish them in a newspaper, magazine, etc. But, you know, should you? In that case, probably not. It's a good idea to ask the kid's parent before you go publishing photographs of them for a wider audience. And it's something that, as we have seen school shootings increase in the United States, there have been this question of, hey, what is the media's role after a school shooting in taking video or photograph or even interviewing kids? Ethics is often about defining what we should do and not really what we can do. The law side of things tends to talk about what we can do. The ethics side of things often talks about what we should do. And that means, of course, there is a warning that comes along with this presentation, and that is that ethics deals in gray areas. It does not deal in absolutes of white and black. There's oftentimes going to be different opinions about how solutions should come about in certain case studies. And if you have an opinion that is different than the one you may see in the textbook or the one that you may hear other people discuss, that's fine. Ethics is multifaceted in its approach. It's more or less thinking about why we make certain decisions than it is about saying that one decision is the best decision. And in ethics, one thing we can do is deal with case studies. Now, case studies are examples of things that media folks have had to deal with in the past. And by looking at case studies, we can see the decisions that the professionals made then. And then we can look at certain philosophical understandings that we know now, and we can sort of study it and say, would we have made that decision and why? Would we not have made that decision and why? So let's look at an example of a case study that gets into a fundamental question of media ethics, which is, when is it okay to act in deception? When is it okay to not be open and honest about what you're doing? Deception is essentially that. It's not being open and honest about what you as someone working in media are up to. So consider the case of the Chicago Sun-Times and their project called The Mirage. The Chicago Sun-Times is one of 2 major newspapers in the Chicago area, and Chicago is one of the larger markets for media in the United States. And at the time, reporters for the Chicago Sun-Times had been getting tips from people into the newsroom that said that the city officials that are supposed to be in charge of things like sort of enforcing regulations and permits and things had been soliciting bribes, which is not really a thing you want your city officials to be doing. And so the Chicago Sun-Times decided that their best way of investigating this was to very covertly buy a bar. So they bought this empty storefront space and they decided that they were going to turn it into a bar, and they called the bar The Mirage, which is hilarious, kind of a funny pun in retrospect. And they didn't tell anybody that the Mirage was owned by the Chicago Sun-Times. They kept it very separated. And they would staff the bar with reporters and photographers pretending to be construction workers or pretending to be managers at the bar, etc. They sort of fooled everybody. And sure enough, when they start needing stuff like building permits and fire inspections and business licenses and liquor licenses and health inspection permits and tax collection, anytime they need something official from the city, they test out trying to offer a bribe. And then if the city official takes the bribe, they photograph them and record them doing it. And they caught tons of people, the city officials who accepted these bribes from folks who they didn't know were actually investigative reporters acting undercover. And they ended up running this into a long series of articles once this thing was said and done. On the, you can see the headline here, "Our Bar Uncovers Payoffs," right? For months, they had just tons of articles that were breaking down very specific things that had happened that demonstrated corruption at the city level. And so it ends up that they become a finalist for the Pulitzer. These series of stories make a really big splash, and they are up for a Pulitzer Prize. But they're about to run into a problem in the process of potentially winning their Pulitzer. And everyone kind of thought they were going to win it. Everyone thought they were the shoe-in winner for that year's investigative journalism Pulitzer Prize. There's two folks that got in the way, though, Ben Bradlee and Eugene Patterson. They were both from the Washington Post, and they had led the charge to get the Chicago Sun-Times coverage removed from the Pulitzer listing and make it so that they couldn't win the Pulitzer. And the Pulitzer Prize Board then released this press statement and said, "The Pulitzer Prize Board decided not to award the Sun-Times the prize because the series was based on deception. The board concluded that truth-telling enterprises should not engage in such tactics." So essentially it was, we're fine with the end result, but how you got there is not something we should encourage. We don't want reporters pretending to be other people. We don't want reporters to be going undercover in that way. And so for a long time, this was sort of a very big point of contention. And these two folks, Bradlee and Patterson, they weren't nobodies in the world of journalism. They were both involved at the Washington Post at very serious times in their careers, both in the coverage of the Watergate scandal, as well as coverage of sort of the rise of the Vietnam War. Both of them are portrayed by different actors in the film The Post, which we talked about last week as well. It's funny how that keeps coming up. And this has been a huge dividing line in journalism ever since. It's been the question of if it is acceptable and how and when is it acceptable to use deception as a form of journalism. It brings us to the question of the theoretical foundations or the underpinnings of the ethics of how we can decide what is ethical and what isn't. So as a warning, this is all about to get very deep and philosophical, and for that I apologize. So let's start with Aristotle. Aristotle was a Greek dude. He was hanging out with his friend Plato at around 350 BC. And he had the idea in terms of what makes something ethical, and that the goal of all human effort is, quote, the good, aka the goal of all human effort is to be happy. Everyone wants to be happy. That is the defining characteristic of what it means to be human. He says that the goal of happiness is to find the balance between excess or having too much of something and defect or not having enough of it. And he calls this the golden mean, that the most ethical thing is the thing in the middle between too much and not enough. And this is often the difference between inaction and full action, right? So doing something fully to the fullest extent versus not doing it at all, that you can find that ethical boundary somewhere in the middle. So you have to ask yourself a question. Is this philosophical underpinning at the individual level or at the group level? And we can very clearly say with Aristotle that it's at the individual level, not at the group level. It's about doing what makes you personally ethical, with the idea that hopefully if everybody follows their own golden mean, and everybody does what's ethical, then we will live in an ethical society. All right, so we have to, for the next one, hop in a time machine and jump forward just a little bit to Germany in the late 1700s, where we have a guy named Immanuel Kant hanging out and thinking about philosophy and ethics. And he was thinking particularly about the concepts of Aristotle and what he had brought to the table. And he kind of said, nah, I don't agree with Aristotle. He said that approaching it only from the actions of one specific individual doesn't work. It's not a viable option because everyone is going to have different perceptions of the concept of the golden mean. They're going to have different concepts for the idea of excess and of defect, of not having enough, right? Like, this is a very extreme way of saying it, but what if somebody decided that they were going to build a cannon that blasted kittens out of it? I don't know why you would do such a thing, but imagine somebody did. According to Aristotle and his golden mean, if the person wants to blast 10 kittens out of the cannon, then that would be the excess, but the not having enough would be blasting no kittens out of a cannon, and therefore it's perfectly ethical to load a cannon up with 10 kittens, or 5 kittens rather, and blast the 5 kittens out of the cannon, because then it's only halfway between 10 kittens and 0. His thing was like, hey, no, there are some things which are wrong no matter what the action is. You can't put a golden mean in the middle of something that is inherently unethical. So instead, he says people are capable of what we call moral reasoning, and that this concept that humans have the capacity for moral reasoning is what we call the categorical imperative. It was his big contribution to the idea of ethics, the categorical imperative. And the best way to sum up the categorical imperative is pretend like what you're doing would become the universal law of nature. If you would not want everybody blasting 5 kittens out of a cannon, then don't blast kittens at all out of a cannon. And Kant doesn't care as much about the individual consequences as much as he cares about the action itself. It's neither an individual nor a group concept, but it is about the action. And so we're starting to get a little bit closer to caring about the group, but it's still at the individual level. And another side effect of his sort of process is that unethical behavior cannot be justified by the possible desirable outcomes. The next person in the lineup of philosophical thinkers is the one who will help us with that. So let's hop on over to contestant number 3, which is JSM, aka John Stuart Mill. He was a British dude hanging out in England in the 1870s. And he thinks that both Aristotle and Immanuel Kant are missing the point, that it's not about the individual and it's not really about the action. He works in a branch of philosophy known as utilitarianism. And utilitarianism is all about helping popularize an ethical underpinning called the principle of utility. And utility can best be summed up as this. It's an act's rightness. An act's rightness is a desirable end, aka consequences of actions are important because what is ethical is what does the greatest amount of good for the largest number of people. So it is outcome-based, and it's outcome-based specifically for the group, not the individual. Whatever helps the most amount of people is what is the right thing to do. And some people took this idea of utilitarianism and built on it to make it even more about the group, but then actually connect it back to the individual. So last but certainly not least, we have this fella, John Rawls. He's hanging out at Cornell University in the 1960s, and he has this idea of being able to glue together older concepts together with modern thinking on utilitarianism. And he says each person is to have an equal right to the most extensive basic liberty compatible with a similar liberty for others. AKA, each person should be able to have the lowest possible level of liberty that works for everybody. No, one person should not be more able to have a freer life than anyone else. Everyone should be at the same level of liberty. And he develops the decision-making process called the veil of ignorance, Initially, the veil of ignorance was sort of a thinking way of philosophically building a society and how you would want that society to be. Like the way that he initially built it was, this is kind of weird, but also remember this was the 1960s. Imagine you are a glowing ball of energy that is circling the earth. And when you press a button, or when you decide or snap your fingers, or whatever it is a glowing orb of energy can do, you're going to randomly become a brand new newborn baby somewhere on the globe. And the question is, what would you want the society to look like that you were going to inhabit in the energy of a newborn baby, if you were able to pick and choose what it would be, right? It turns out that in the process of doing this, most people pick societies that are at the most level, right? They tend to pick societies with lower income inequality and better healthcare and education. They tend to pick places that look more like Denmark or Norway, because there is more of a middle line there, and your law of averages says that your ball of energy is going to inhabit a newborn that will not be born into a family in poverty. If we think about this in terms of how it applies to media ethics, it's that we should make decisions without considering the social status of the people involved, or considering where we ourselves fall into that social system, that we should make these decisions as if everyone we were dealing with was equal. And this is sort of a quote to pull that says, the only thing that a given member knows about themselves is that they are in possession of the basic capacities necessary to fully and willfully participate in an enduring system of mutual cooperation. Each knows they can be a member of the society. And how we apply that when we think about that term in terms of media ethics is that when we're making an ethical decision, don't consider if the people we are dealing with are powerful or powerless, rich or poor, black or white, man or woman, to treat the situation based solely on how it will impact the fairness level within the group itself. So that is a very, very basic look at four philosophers and the case study. And like I said, this is not going to be used in a specific quiz, but you will find a couple questions from this video on the final exam. So with that, thank you all very much. This is the last video in the semester. Thank you all for putting up with me and my voice and my recorded face in these weird times we live in, being the only way to have lectures. So stay safe out there, and it has been a great one.